I'd like to invite all the panellists to sit up here and we can ask them questions, grill them. Gee, if we can go to the effort of putting Eastern Suburbs Banksia scrub on a roof, you'd think we can go to the effort of finding a few ground sites for it as well, don't you? As well as lots of roofs. So have we got any questions from the floor for any of the speakers? Just put your hand up and we'll send a microphone round to you. You're all very satisfied. Some of these things we can't do anything about. We're parking them so that we can try and work out, well, how can ANPC and ARBA further these discussions? Because at many of these sorts of forums, it's you can forgive people for thinking that they're just talk fests. We all come up with a good analysis of what's needed and nothing ever happens to the ideas after that. So we would like to take these ideas and try and find where they belong. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3...
There's a question for Katie actually. So you're talking about Skyville and you're talking about using direct seeding techniques to install that. I sort of understood that you were suggesting that, are you thinking of setting up seed production areas within Skyville which will be used for restoring the site? And in that case, were you also suggesting that seed and that national parks as a whole somehow might become involved in supplying seed to the rest of the industry?
So the question that was asked was whether national parks would consider establishing their own seed production area and then be able to supply seed to other industry partners. The short answer to that is no. I don't really think that that's our business. However, we're very keen to support people in that field. So, for example, we were working a lot with Paul Gibson-Roy and Samantha in Greening Australia, and I'm very hopeful that into the future that we can get a production area that's big enough to be able to supply seed that we need in Western Sydney.
Excellent. There was another question from up here.
Mike, can I, with your seed banking, are you looking at individual species or a variety of species within each plot?
Yeah, I think this is working. Yep, definitely a variety of species in each plot. And it's certainly, as I said, there's a few things. One is the availability of the correct seed and the varieties that are going to work in the different areas that we're going to put the plots. As I said, we're going to have those trial plots at the nursery itself, Curl. We're also got a permaculture plot up Seaforth somewhere. We're going to trial that and then just see what seed's available. There's definitely still a bit more work to do, but and it's also driven by the community. So we will only put plots in where people are interested in looking after them because we simply can't do it ourselves. It's going to be driven by the community. But so far, I think from the interest, we will get a lot of interest.
Any other questions?
Thanks. I'm just going to take this opportunity, since we've been talking about volunteers and the importance of volunteers, and picking up from Tein's point and Paul's earlier. I think one of the things Paul mentioned at the beginning was that we're really not an industry, that we are a cottage industry if we're an industry at all. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we have come from a volunteer base where our workforce has been volunteers. We are not recognising or pushing the paid workforce, and they are an important part. Any industry that is an industry has a workforce, and we have not been acknowledging that component or providing a support for them to have a base. We also need an industry association. So Tein, yes, we need, I think, ARBA to be, if it can step up to that, to be an industry voice for for us at a government and policy level. We are only going to change things if we actually change government regulation and policy, and we have to start working together at that kind of a level.
So do you mean for the seed supply industry? Seed?
I'm talking about for the whole
revegetation
reconstruction industry as a whole, of which seed will be a component.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm suspecting this is where there's maybe more for the
There is certainly room
session.
in Arbor. In 2012, Arbor expanded to ecological restoration as a whole rather than only bush regeneration. So it's a matter of us taking those steps as a volunteer organisation to to become,
Yes.
we just need more members who pay their dues, and then we can possibly employ more people to grow.
Yes. Well,
Thank you.
It may be that Arbor takes this role, or it may be that Arbor forms partnerships. But I'm coming from the forestry, I'm involved with forestry, and I see the huge amount of research grants, policy decisions, government support for a multi-million-dollar loss industry. They lose per state. Every single state government department of forestry loses $6 million to $20 million a year. And yet they have all this support, whereas our industry has none. And we need to work out a way to start galvanising that kind of support.
Well, Paul, where is Paul? Paul, would you like to come up onto the panel?
Come on down.
Look, yeah, that's a really good point, isn't it? It highlights a conundrum that I think we face, is that I don't think anyone wants to diminish the importance of volunteerism. It makes an amazing contribution both to people's lives, where they get that opportunity to do it, and also to local communities. But sadly, in the environment sector, because as you point out, the paid element is so depauperate, what we're waiting for is for people to reach a point in their life where they're financially able and they're retired and they have the time and perhaps the will to contribute back to society through various forms of volunteerism. But we're putting a very heavy burden on them. So I've spoken and been lucky enough to be asked to speak to a number of bush care groups around Sydney, and you go and you talk to just remarkable groups of people, but they're all 60 to 80 to 90, beautiful, wonderful people. But they say, look, this is a pretty tough gig. You're out there in the sun and, it gets a bit hard. And as Michael pointed out, there's ticks around, all those sorts of things. So I think it's unfair for society to put the burden wholly on our mature age people. Now, fine, if that's what they want to do, that's great. And anyone else, children and young people. But it is normally older people who do all the volunteerism. What we have to do, I absolutely agree, is to generate an industry that creates momentum for a paid workforce. In our survey, and this is not my thought, I'm not editorialising here, we got a number of written comments back from people in the industry to say that they were concerned at times that where government was supporting organisations, particular NGOs or local councils or LGAs through volunteerism, then in some ways that takes money away from the paid workforce. So things at times like Green Army and things like that, where there are these quasi-social programs that are linked up to environmental ones as well. For a short-term gain, a lot of our agencies are encouraged to make use of these things, and all the people who are in private business who relied very much on that work, well, all of a sudden that's dried up. And then all of a sudden those programs wrap up, and then there's no one there to do the work because a number of people have gone out of business. They were the sort of tenor of the comments that were made. So I don't think any of those comments were meant with malice towards volunteerism. I just think that they highlight a valid point that at times volunteerism can artificially support some organisations and really reduce their cost base, while a whole bunch of other private organisations aren't able to compete with that sort of, it's not a level playing field.
Thanks, Paul. And I think as part of the solution, I don't think we should use the term cottage industry. I think we should call ourselves an industry, albeit a small industry. We are an industry. Bush regeneration industry has been going for about 35, 40 years. It's a growing industry, yep. And I would say the seed production and supply and reconstruction industry will be bigger, but it will take time. So we are an industry.
Every major project that goes on around New South Wales at least has a space for a bush generator to work in those projects, and they seek bush generators to work for. We're definitely an industry. We definitely stand on our own 2 feet. Northwest Rail Link, every motorway project you've seen go through Sydney, every single one, a environmental restoration or a bush regeneration company has had some input into that major project. They don't want landscapers to revegetate their natural areas. They want bush regeneration companies. And that's because bush regeneration companies have staff that are trained in conservation and they know how these vegetation systems work. And they're building vegetation systems that will last the distance. And that's an industry. That's an industry standing on its own 2 feet. And to be fair, it has grown on the back of volunteers, and it won't persist without volunteers continuing. But we are moving forward and we're getting bigger, and it's the only way we're going to deal with this massive problem is to take a full professional approach to delivering the services that they need.
Yeah.
Tein, can I make a quick
Yes,
point?
please, John.
Not entering into the argument of private sector versus volunteers, but there is a possible solution to keeping volunteers. I worked for Australian Volunteers International a couple of times in the fairly remote past. They pay a very tiny per diem. So it's not, strictly speaking, Volunteers International. They do pay a per diem allowance. And if that principle somehow could be imported into the volunteering area, it might retain a lot more people and achieve a lot more than is being achieved now.
Possibly including younger people who are in transition to a different career. Thank you very much, John. Good idea.
Yeah,
Michael?
I think my experience would be people don't volunteer for any sort of payment or reimbursement. I guess some people may like that. But generally they're out there because they're passionate about the environment and they love the environment. And as we know, I mean, I've got so many volunteers out there that are much more experienced than me on the ground that have been doing it for so long. It's just incredible. And that knowledge, and also, as I say, there's 250 volunteers and each one of them has an opinion on how we should be seed collecting, how we should have provenance against diversity and all these different things. There's no right and wrong. There's no perfect science in it. We're not sure exactly what sort of landscapes we're dealing with sometimes. We don't know how many times they've been modified. The seed we're collecting, the genetic integrity of that seed all the time. We'd like to think we do, but I'm not sure we really do.
And sorry, can I just add to that too? Because I think, you know, you're absolutely right, Michael, about why volunteers volunteer. I think it often is for altruistic reasons and they see the benefits of being in the natural environment. But I also think that I'm seeing more and more younger, different types of volunteers working in this space, including in nurseries. And they're volunteering for other reasons too. They don't necessarily want to get paid, but they want to develop their skills, their expertise. They may have to do it to tick a few boxes to get some sort of registration or something like that. So there are a variety of reasons, and that's what I guess I was trying to sort of get my head around, how we can help harness some of that as well. Is that providing that capacity and helping them to develop their skills? Doing it more methodically, I don't know. They're doing it, you know, I know the Habitat Network's doing an amazing job with developing the skills and capacities. Possibly some nurseries do it better than others. So is there ways that we can all, as a room here, help with that? There's
certainly a compatibility between volunteers and the paid workforce. It's more the perception of whether the paid workforce exists and is legitimate and required, and it's up to the NGOs to make sure that that perception is not founded on some flimsy idea. It's got to be quite clear that it is a profession or a trade. Any other questions? Yep.
I think there was a survey this week, apparently, of what people want to see change, and apparently I think the environment's like one of the big factors now. I think people are starting to wake up themselves, particularly like with climate change. People are starting to really wake up to themselves because it's happening right now. It's not, it's not something that's gonna, we need to act now. If we don't act now, we're going to be in serious trouble.
That's right. And there was a very good video recently published with Greta Thunberg and what's that wonderful English, George Monbiot. If you Google that, it talks about, makes a link between climate change mitigation and revegetation. It's basically talking about ecological restoration. It has to happen now.
Yep.
Yep. Thank you. You've got a question.
Yeah, it's actually a comment back to the question about volunteering. I believe there's been some recent changes in legislation that's going to dramatically change how we approach volunteers. And it's worth, for those of you who work with volunteers, it's worth looking into. And basically what the legislation is saying is if you do something that is like a job, including like some kind of per diem, it's considered to be employment and therefore required to be paid at a minimum wage. So I would be checking into your volunteer policy and making sure it's compliant with that new law.
Yes, there are two questions there. Yep, one.
Look, just a quick comment to John. You're having trouble finding rooftop gardens. I'm just wondering whether Eastern Suburbs Banksia Scrub may be adaptable to vertical gardens, because there'd be plenty of scope for that in the eastern suburbs.
That's a nice comment. Do you have any response to that, John?
What exactly do you mean by vertical garden?
There are landscape architects here who know.
Walls? You mean walls?
Yes, green walls.
How can you...
Speechless.
It's not going to apply, is it? The likelihood of success on a green roof is very high, given the admittedly relatively limited experience of international green roofs and endangered plant species and their conservation. It's all been successful, even though there hasn't been a huge amount of work. So I think it's likely to be very successful. You have doubts, do you? Oh.
It'd be better than chlorophytum hanging from those walls, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I didn't.
Look, yeah.
A lot of this is around technical feasibility. I've got on my my screensaver here a shot of the 30-storey buildings in Broadway. Now, they're 30 and 20-storey buildings which are just draped in vegetation. Now, most of it's probably exotic, some of it's native. It's around function, and they're just picking species for that. But again, it just shows what you can do when you've got the technology, you've got the budget, and you've got the will. So we could be draping houses, roofs, bowling greens, roadsides. The potential is immense. What we lack, to some degree, I think, is the belief and the enthusiasm. And that's where the crazy Americans really seem to have trumped us. Thank you, I'll be here all week.
Could I add to that, though?
Yeah, but for better or worse, they believe things can be done.
They do, but they can believe things can be destroyed with no impunity, with impunity. In other words, if we have to combine that optimism with aspiration to actually conserve, because if we think that we can replace conservation with restoration, or we can replace restoration of real sites with walls and roofs, I think we're in real trouble.
Yeah. But Tein, can I reply, please?
Yes.
Because I've, with all due respect, that is an absolutely valid argument. But I've heard that posed to me from the moment I stepped out as an undergrad and posed the idea that we should start to restore, because essentially conservation, which I am fundamentally obsessed with, that we should be conserving and making sure things don't disappear. But what we have found year on year on year, for me at least the last 30 years, with all the protections that we've brought into place, with EPBC Acts, with Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act, with you name it, things continue to decline every time we do a State of the Nation. Now, surely that is a cue for us to say, yes, let's never forget conservation. But on the basis of the reality, it's going backwards and at some point it disappears. So unless we do seize those opportunities, and some of them are going to be dumb as all hell, and they're not going to work, and we'll be putting things in dumb places, but if we do it enough, some of it will work. And we will get stuff, even if it's a refuge for the next 10 years or 4 decades, and then we can start to build up spots and resources. So I believe the stupid Americans, with all their crazy belief, have at least shown me when I went there, where they've done millions of hectares of restorations on farms and roadsides and in cities. And sure,
That's right.
they've cleared and done crazy, awful things. But I look back over the same 30 years in Australia, and comparatively, compare the size of the population and rationalise it for economies, they are still light years ahead of us.
That's
and
right.
I think we need to take something from that.
That's great. And one of the things is that they... the Society for Ecological Restoration is very strong in the United States and the rest of the world, and they don't see it as an either or. They see it as complementary, that restoration is part of conservation. It's the whole international restoration standards is about net gain. That's my point. Somebody else had a comment, a question?
I have a couple of comments about ESBS.
Yes.
I'd be a bit disturbed to see what's left of the 146 hectares of ESBS being collected for spreading on to roofs. Are you hearing me? Yeah. Because John's not hearing me. I've been sourcing plants from Randwick Nursery for the last 15 years for revegetation projects around the eastern suburbs, and in that time I've watched the species selection decline significantly, being driven by profit or break-even policies with the council, and I cannot source all the species that I need to from eastern suburbs. I think that's being driven by the landscape industry and landscape architects, and I think that's back to Jono's point right at the beginning of the day. That's something that we've spoken about a little bit but needs a lot more emphasis. And if you do want to see a green roof in the eastern suburbs, you can go to North Bondi Toilet Block and see what we've done down there.
Fantastic, that's really good. We haven't got a hell of a lot of time. 2 more questions, unfortunately.
I just wanted to talk a bit about how something that sort of relates to the previous group and this group. It's my sort of observation is that a lot of the conversation and a lot of the thinking is reflected in how the Biodiversity Conservation Trust is kind of working at the moment. Like, we still have this paradigm of we'll fence off one area and have that as the city and the development, and we'll do whatever we want there, and then we'll fix somewhere else in the hinterland and sort of offset it. I think we need to start breaking that down and doing what Michael and what John and what Paul are talking about, where we think about the city in a totally new way as part of the ecosystem that we're living in. We can't, and I think the legislation as it stands isn't really geared towards a sort of fine-grained response that is able to, implement lots of small projects that obviously have more sort of administrative costs and so forth. But as we're losing biodiversity and habitat throughout the world, everything is getting closer and closer into the city, and we need to get more out of the city in terms of addressing the biodiversity loss that is causing this catastrophic climate change and environmental degradation. So I feel like that's something that we need to be talking about a lot more, is how we can use cities to respond to this and not just sort of leave it to the Central West and Cobar and Louth to be developing all of these biodiversity credits. Like, those people, like, to be fair, I don't know, I've worked out there, then there are people who are starting to come around to carbon farming and biodiversity credits and stuff out there, but we can't rely on that. I mean, it's red desert out there, and we need to be engaging small landholders and engaging landscape architects and engaging councils and engaging parks and engaging streetscapes and all of these places to address what is a global issue. So
terrific.
I thought that's just...
I'm looking forward to some further action from you in the future. One more question.
I just want to comment that I think the volunteers and the professionals is not an either or. I know the professional work is done when the funding is available, and the volunteer work is done by concerned residents who care about their community when there's no funding. And I think most of you professionals will have worked on sites when the funding's been there and come back 3 years later to find a mess. So having the volunteers maintaining that is important. And the other thing is that the volunteers are your best marketing tool, keeping the councils honest with funding for their local environment, and also for pushing and getting grants that pay for a lot of the work that you do. So I think we're complementary.
Complementary, exactly.
Yeah, I totally agree. And just a really quick note, I came out of the bush regeneration industry. I spent 8 years on the ground working for contractors. So I totally see the contractor side of it and that ground management. And interestingly, I think the contractors are really involved in getting the young, because they are getting paid, and young people are coming out of universities and out of these degrees with not necessarily jobs to go to. And the bush regen industry can really be a great avenue for them to get out there, learn ecology on the ground, learn the plant identification, and also they are the next generation coming forward. And then, as Robin, rightly pointed out, you cannot underestimate the value of the volunteers advocating at a council level to their councillors, and they listen to them. And just getting back, there was another point about the environment and what people think of it. Every survey that Northern Beaches Council does about what people think or what they want done in the local government area, environment is number one by a mile every time. So it is really, and council's guided by that.
Fantastic. We haven't got any room for any more questions, but at this particular session, but there's more room later because Martin's now going to be chairing another session.
Wait, there's more.
Yes, and this one is kind of like a real plenary where we wrap up some of the issues we've talked about, and then we're going to actually develop a communique or press release with some of those issues articulated.